So before we get into all of the many amazing things in the brush palette and all the stuff that you can do with those incredible brush settings, let's take a look at the most basic brush just by itself. So if we have some brush, you'll notice a lot of times you can see it in these tiny icons. Let's see if we can expand that. Nope. Many of the things that they've done, they still don't have a good way to visualize this stuff. So over here you have these little dabs essentially, and if you were to click with a bigger dab, you'd see a shape, right? The outline. And I'm sure you played with this a little bit for the very least. And if you go through a couple of different ones, you'd see that they have different outlines on things. Well, where this outline comes from and what this kind of brush is called is a capture brush. And a capture brush is just an image that someone has drawn or a photo that they've taken, and then they've turned it into a brush through essentially capture. And if you go to edit, you should have define brush preset. And this is kind of confusing because a lot of times you'd think that a brush preset would be the settings inside the brush, but that's just the vocabulary that they used to use. Now we're on to brush settings, and a preset can actually be inside of the settings. But at the same time, a preset can be the brush settings preset, which contains a brush preset. It's a bunch of nonsense at this point, so don't worry about it. But what we do need to worry about is a capture brush. So let's do something really fun real quick. Let us go and pick up our very favorite Snail of Science. And if we were to go into week 4, I believe is when we did a little snail on a screen. No, that was week 3 where we did the snail on the screen. So let's go back to week 3 and grab our snail. And here we are, snail with mask, small. That sounds perfect. You remember the snail? It's our Snail of Science. So we're going to go ahead and just see what this does. We'll define a brush preset. Not define pattern. We'll cover that a little later, right? Not in this week, but a little later in the semester. For now, define brush preset. Boop. Oh, this gets interesting. Snail with mask small. Okay. Now it says PSD because that's the name of all this. So we could name it anything we want. But now we've got a brush. So let's come back to our brush and click once. It's the snail. And it's the snail in a grayscale. So it's a grayscale snail. Now, if we were to draw with this, we can see this very, very strange behavior. Actually, that's amazing. I love that. Let's take a look at this horrifying thing we've done. Move this a little bit. We can get here. Pop over to a new layer. Wow. But notice if we just drag, left or right or what have you, it doesn't rotate or anything. It's just dropping down. Any of you guys play the old Solitaire on earlier versions of Windows? When you'd win, it would be like Solitaire, boink. Solitaire, boink, and all the cards would just fly out. Same kind of process. So what's going on here? Well, the one thing we did cover was spacing. And so if we go to our brush presets and we bring our spacing up to 100, it's essentially a snail stamp. Pretty neat. It gets more interesting than that. So remember, the snail was actually in color, but what happened here was that it captured it as a grayscale image. And if you and it makes sense because if you just kept clicking forever, eventually you get pretty much black. And there are a few points where it's not. Where it was white, you'd see it's actually still transparent. So this is giving us some clues as to what the brush actually captured. Let's go ahead and explore that a little bit more with a 1 by 1 inch document at 300 pixels per inch, and again RGB 8-bit, just because that's how we've been doing it. Let's say we didn't even have transparency. Let's just go in with a brush, even if it's our beautiful snail brush, and start producing something in here. Maybe this tube, a little bit bigger in some places. This has potential, I suppose. So we come in here and we paint in this object made of snails, which, as I say it, this sounds like some kind of horror movie waiting to happen. Then they opened the room, and the room was nothing but snails. So let's go ahead and go in here, and we'll just make the snails smaller as they go back. Okay, so we're just flat out on black and white, yeah? Nothing too fancy. We didn't even make a new layer. It's just right on there. What happens if we capture this? Now, going off of what we saw before, it essentially treated the snail as a grayscale image, but it treated the white as transparent. Now, we've seen this behavior one other time in Photoshop. If you take an image, make it black and white, and set it to multiply, the white is knocked out and the grayscale in it is left alone. Essentially, it just darkens everything. So it gives us a hint as to how it's treating this. So let's go ahead and try again with an edit and define brush preset. And we'll call this sample brush. Tell it okay. Now notice that I have a snail now in here in the brush settings, and over here I have the snail tube. And over in brushes, I have not inside of any of our wonderful little folder groups that we've painstakingly maintained. It's actually outside of everything. And a lot of the times that's how Photoshop's going to drop stuff out. So you'll want to kind of pop it back in. But let's take our horrifying snail tube and make a new document here and just draw with it. So interesting. Couple of things going on here. The opacity is only 40%, so we're not seeing the whole thing. Let me turn that up. Had nothing to do with it. Sure enough, we have a tube for snails. That's it. And let's zoom in and take a look. Yeah, where it was lighter, you do in fact have a more transparent clump of snails. Where it was darker, you have a darker set of snails. Now to show this off a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and create a solid color using the adjustment layer, and I'll just, let's do blue. We'll make it blue. And sure enough, you can see that it has some transparency in some areas, but not in others. So that's basically all the capture brush is doing. It takes the black and it turns it into a pixel from the new brush dab, and then we can make a stroke out of dabs. And then any place as it gets lighter, it becomes more transparent. At white, it becomes fully transparent and isn't captured. That's all that happens with it. Now this has a lot of potential. We can essentially draw our own brush, and once we've drawn our own brush, we can capture it again and keep building up brushes that way. And that's what we did with our horrifying snail tube. And if you wanted to, you could go in. Oh, but remember, you have to have brush, otherwise you can't get to these settings. You could alter the spacing of your horrifying snail tube, and you could go in there. It's mad because I'm trying to paint on an adjustment layer. It doesn't like that. And now we have horrifying tubes of snails. But again, it's not following anything where it's going. It's stuck just as is. We can't do any adjustments with it. It's just weird, right? Well, the thing is, we can do adjustments with it. By default, it just doesn't have any useful adjustments set. So let's go ahead and with our captured horrifying snail tube, which I'm going to rename as horrifying snail tube between videos, we'll play around with some settings and see what we can do to a capture brush. I'll see you next video.